If you have looked up the average net worth for Canadians between 55 and 64 and landed on a number close to $1,100,000, you have probably felt a small drop in your stomach. That figure comes from Statistics Canada and it is real. But it is also misleading because the household sitting exactly in the middle of that same age group holds closer to $873,400. The average gets pulled up hard by a small group of extremely wealthy households, and if you compare your own numbers to that inflated figure, you will walk away thinking you are behind when you are not. Here is the part that matters more than the national number. Where you live can add or subtract $300,000 from what you actually need to retire comfortably. A retiree in Toronto or Vancouver can need a portfolio 30% to 50% larger than someone retiring in rural Saskatchewan or a small town in Atlantic Canada, just to cover the same groceries, the same heating bill, and the same property taxes. Follow a generic checklist built for the national average, and you risk one of two outcomes: working 5 extra years you did not need to work, or running short of money by your late 70s because the plan never accounted for your postal code. So this is not going to be a generic 5-point checklist. We are going to run a real stress test, one built around what retirement actually costs in Canada in 2026, region by region, so you can find out whether your $873,400 or your $1,500,000 is actually enough for where you live. Before we get to point 1, it helps to understand something freeing. The average Canadian retiree, the one everyone compares themselves to, does not really exist. Once you see why, the rest of this gets a lot less stressful. Let's slow down on that $1,100,000 number, because it is doing a lot of damage to people who do not deserve it. Statistics Canada's national average net worth for households aged 55 to 64 sits around $1,100,000. The median, meaning the household exactly in the middle of that group, sits around $873,400. That gap of more than $225,000 exists because a small slice of ultra-wealthy households pulls the average far above where most people actually stand. When you compare your own retirement account to that average, you are not comparing yourself to a typical Canadian. You are comparing yourself to a mathematical distortion. I have watched this happen more times than I can count. Someone looks at a headline that says the average retiree has over $1 million, glances at their own RRSP statement, and feels like they have already failed before they have even started drawing down. That feeling is understandable, and it is also based on the wrong number. You are not behind. You are comparing your middle-of-the-pack reality to a top 10% anomaly, and those two things were never meant to sit side by side. This is exactly why the standard advice falls apart for so many people. The common rule you hear is to save 15% to 20% of your income for retirement, no matter who you are. But that rule assumes every household looks the same, and they do not. If you started saving seriously in your 40s, 20% a year might not be enough to close the gap in time. If you have owned a home in a major Canadian city for 30 years, and your mortgage is long paid off, 10% might be more than plenty because your biggest asset already did most of the work for you. A flat percentage rule cannot account for either of those realities, and treating it like gospel is how people end up either panicking unnecessarily or undersaving without realizing it. The honest starting point is your own number, not the national one. Take your current savings, your home equity if you plan to use it, and your expected CPP and OAS. Add them together and compare that total to the median in your own province. Not the national average pulled up by outliers most of us will never meet. Provincial medians vary too, so a household in Alberta and a household in Ontario are not actually being measured against the same baseline. even though the headlines usually treat the whole country as one number. If you are tired of being told you need $2 million to retire, when you are actually trying to make $600,000 work in a mid-sized Canadian city, this is the kind of math we do here. Subscribe if that is useful to you, but even $873,400 can be the wrong benchmark if you are using it in the wrong province. There is a gap of roughly $300,000 hiding inside that median number, and it depends entirely on where you plan to spend your retirement. Here is the number most retirement checklists never mention. A retiree in Toronto can need 30% to 50% more in savings than a retiree in rural Saskatchewan or a small town in Atlantic Canada, just to maintain the exact same day-to-day life, same groceries, same car insurance renewal, same trip to the pharmacy. The difference is not lifestyle, it is postal code. Think of it as a purchasing power map layered on top of your retirement number. Toronto's cost of shelter and everyday services runs about 1.4 times the national average. A community in rural Saskatchewan often runs closer to 0.8 times that average. So if you need $5,000 a month after tax to live comfortably, a Toronto retiree drawing from a portfolio, plus CPP and OAS, might need something in the range of $1,200,000 to generate that income reliably. A retiree in a smaller community chasing the same $5,000 a month might get there with closer to $900,000. Same target income, different price of admission, and the gap between those two numbers is close to $300,000. Let me tell you about Jim and Sarah, two Canadians who are 62 and have done almost everything right. They have $800,000 sitting across their RRSPs and TFSAs, which is a solid position for their age. But they live in Mississauga, and their property taxes, utilities, and general cost of living eat up close to 40% of their fixed income once CPP and OAS start flowing in. On paper, their number looks fine. In practice, they are fragile because every increase in their hydro bill or their property tax assessment cuts directly into money they were counting on for groceries and prescriptions. You do not need a moving van to find your own version of this gap. Start with three numbers you likely already have sitting in a drawer somewhere: your property tax bill, your home insurance renewal, and your provincial health premium or extra billing costs if your province charges one. Add those together for where you live now. Then compare them to the same three numbers in a community you would actually be willing to retire in. That difference, multiplied out over 20 or 30 years of retirement, is your real location gap. And for a lot of Canadians, it is worth more than any single investment decision they will make this decade. Here is what almost nobody tells people in Jim and Sarah's position. If they relocated to a smaller community, somewhere like a mid-sized town outside Thunder Bay or just outside Moncton, they could move from fragile to resilient without saving another single dollar. Same $800,000. Same government benefits. A completely different retirement, purely because the cost of living dropped underneath them. I used to tell everyone to aim for the same magic number, whatever the popular target happened to be that year. I do not do that anymore. I realize that number means nothing until you know where you are actually going to spend it. $1 million in Vancouver and $1 million outside Moncton are not the same retirement. They are not even close. This does not mean you need to move to afford retirement. It means the location gap has to be part of your math from the start, not something you discover by accident 3 years in, when the property tax bill goes up again and the numbers stop working the way they used to on paper. Location is one lever you can pull, but it is not the biggest one. For a lot of Canadians heading into their 60s, the single biggest quiet threat to their retirement is how they have been trained to think about their mortgage. Somewhere along the way, be completely debt-free before you retire became treated as gospel. It is not wrong exactly, but it is not automatically right either. And treating it as a rule instead of a choice can quietly cost you tens of thousands of dollars. Picture two versions of the same decision. You have an extra $50,000 sitting in savings and a mortgage sitting at 3.5% interest. Scenario 1, you put that $50,000 straight onto the mortgage. You save real interest and you get the emotional relief of owing less. Scenario 2, you put that same $50,000 into a TFSA instead, where the 2026 contribution limit is $7,000 a year, or into an RSP, and it grows at something closer to 7% a year, which is roughly the long-run historical blend of Canadian and US stock markets. Run that second scenario out over 10 years, and the growth on that $50,000 outpaces the interest you would have saved by paying down a 3.5% mortgage by somewhere around $50,000. That is not a small rounding error. That is a decade of compounding you give up the moment you decide debt freedom matters more than growth, without actually running the numbers. Here is the part that makes this urgent. Only about 28% of Canadians aged 55 to 64 are completely debt-free. Most people are not choosing between debt-free and some debt. They are choosing between different kinds of debt, and not every kind carries the same risk. There is poison debt, high interest, unpredictable, tied to something that is losing value. And there is what I would call strategic debt, a low, fixed-rate mortgage on a home that is holding or gaining value, paired with a healthy pile of liquid savings you can actually access. The first kind should scare you. The second kind, on its own, should not. Think about two retirees standing at the same age, roughly the same income. One has paid off every dollar of debt but has almost nothing sitting in cash or a TFSA because every spare dollar went to the mortgage. If a furnace dies or a health cost shows up unexpectedly, they have no cushion, only equity locked inside a house that is expensive and slow to access. The other retiree is still carrying a modest, low-interest mortgage, but has $200,000 sitting in a TFSA for exactly that kind of moment. On paper, the first person looks more responsible. In practice, the second person is more resilient, because resilience in retirement is about access to cash, not the absence of a mortgage statement. If you are carrying debt right now, the real question is not whether to eliminate it. It is whether it is poison or strategic, and that single distinction changes everything about how urgently you should be paying it down. But even someone who enters retirement with zero debt at all can still be leaving real money on the table. In the form of a government paycheck, most people claim years too early. There is a version of retirement income most Canadians already own, and most Canadians take far too early purely out of fear. That is CPP and OAS. And how you time them is one of the few decisions in your entire retirement plan that comes with a guaranteed inflation-protected return. Here are the numbers as they stand for 2026. The maximum CPP payment at 65 is $1,507.65 a month, though very few people actually qualify for the maximum. The average CPP payment sits closer to $925 a month. OAS for the July to September quarter of 2026 pays up to $742.31 a month for someone between 65 and 74, and that number gets reviewed and adjusted every quarter, so it shifts slightly throughout the year. Take CPP early at 60 instead of 65, and your payment drops by 36% for life. Wait until 70 instead of 65, and it rises by 42% for life. OAS works on a similar logic, rising by 36% if you wait until 70 instead of starting at 65. Here is why that timing decision matters more than it looks. Life expectancy tables suggest a 65-year-old Canadian woman today has roughly a coin flip's chance of living past 90. CPP and OAS are the only pieces of your retirement that keep paying no matter how long you live and no matter what the stock market does. Delaying them is not gambling. It is closer to buying longevity insurance, paid for with a few years of patience instead of a premium. Remember Jim and Sarah from earlier. Jim takes CPP at 60 because he is worried, somewhat understandably, that the government program will not be there in the shape he expects by the time he is older. Sarah waits until 70. Using the average CPP payment as a baseline, Jim's payment locks in at roughly $592 a month for life, while Sarah's locks in at roughly $1,313 a month for life. Jim starts collecting a decade earlier, so for a long stretch he is ahead in total dollars received. But the gap closes as the years pass, and somewhere around age 78, Sarah's higher monthly payment catches up to everything Jim collected early. By the time they are both 82, Sarah has received roughly $33,000 more in total CPP payments than Jim has, and her monthly income from that point forward keeps outpacing his for as long as either of them lives. There is one more number worth knowing if your income sits on the higher side. The OAS recovery tax, sometimes called the clawback, starts reducing your OAS once net income passes roughly $95,323, and it claws back the full payment by around $155,109. If your income is anywhere near that range, the order you draw from your RRSP TFSA and any non-registered accounts can matter almost as much as when you start CPP and OAS in the first place. Most people who take CPP early are not doing the math. They are reacting to a psychological fear, the same fear that makes people grab the money the moment it is offered, just in case. That instinct is worth understanding because the same instinct shows up again the moment retirement actually starts and the paycheck disappears for good. For 30 or 40 years, a big part of how you saw yourself was tied to a paycheck and a T4 slip at the end of the year. Then one day that stops, and a lot of Canadians are not prepared for how strange that feels, even when the money side of retirement is actually fine. Psychologists sometimes call this a loss of utility. Your role, your routine, and your sense of contribution were wrapped up in work, and when the paycheck disappears, it can feel less like freedom and more like a void. This is not a character flaw, and it does not mean you plan poorly. It means you spent decades training yourself to be a saver, and now you are being asked to become a spender almost overnight, and that is a genuinely large psychological shift, not a small one. It shows up in small ways too, not knowing what day of the week it is by a Wednesday afternoon, or feeling a flicker of guilt over a weekday morning grocery run, back when that time used to belong to an employer. If the idea of pulling your first $10,000 out of your RRIF makes you uneasy, even though your plan says it is completely safe, that reaction is normal. You are not being irrational. You are unwinding 30 years of instinct in a single afternoon. Here is a small, practical way to test that feeling instead of just living with it. Try a practice retirement weekend. Spend exactly what your retirement budget actually allows for 3 full days, no more, no less, and pay attention to how it feels. If it feels like deprivation, one of two things is true. Either your spending plan is genuinely too tight and needs revisiting, or the number is fine and what needs adjusting is the mindset that is still stuck in scarcity mode. I remember a client years ago with more than $3 million sitting in his accounts who still clipped coupons for 50 cents off his coffee, not because he needed to, but because he had never learned how to turn off the survival instinct from his 30s. His money was never the problem. His identity had not caught up to his balance sheet. If you want a plan that covers both your bank account and your peace of mind, not just one or the other, this channel is built around exactly that. Subscribe if that is the kind of retirement planning that is useful to you. Let's bring this back together. Stop measuring yourself against the $1,100,000 average and find your real median instead, because that comparison alone removes a huge amount of unnecessary guilt. Calculate your own location gap, because the same $800,000 can mean fragile in one city and resilient 2 hours down the highway. Audit your debt honestly, and stop treating every mortgage payment as an emergency when a strategic, low-interest one paired with real liquid savings can leave you stronger, not weaker. Time your CPP and OAS with actual numbers instead of fear, because that single decision can be worth tens of thousands of dollars over the course of a normal retirement. And give yourself permission to feel strange about the identity shift that comes with no longer earning a paycheck, because that feeling is common, not a sign that something has gone wrong. None of this depends on hitting one perfect number. Retirement in Canada in 2026 is not really about who has the most money sitting in an account. It is about who has built in the most flexibility, the most room to adjust if a hydro bill jumps or a health cost shows up without warning. Whether your number today is closer to $400,000 or closer to $4 million, the same 5-point framework applies, because it is built around your actual life, not a national headline, and not the postal code someone else happens to live in. These 5 checks will not remove every uncertainty from retirement, and nothing really can. But they replace vague anxiety with an actual number you can look at, adjust, and revisit every year as your own life changes. If this kind of grounded, no-fluff Canadian retirement math is useful to you, subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is built around going forward.